12th, the night the house went quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than any applause, Eddie Levert did what he has always done when the world stops making sense. He listened for a note that could hold him up. At 83, he has spent more than 6 decades teaching strangers how to feel, how to forgive, how to keep moving, his voice becoming the warm rail people grab when life tilts. But grief does not respect legacies. It does not pause for Hall of Fame speeches or for a catalog of classics. It walks straight through the front door and takes what it wants. And for Eddie, it has returned again and again with a cruelty that sounds almost impossible when you say it out loud. 2 sons gone in the span of barely 2 years, then the mother of those sons, and then, most recently, his youngest daughter Ryan, only 22, taken after a battle with lupus, turning the last remaining light in his private world into another name he has to whisper in the dark. When people talk about him, they usually start with the OJs, with Love Train and Backstabbers, and For the Love of Money, as if the hits can explain the man. But those songs are only the public layer, the part we are allowed to touch. The real story lives in the gap between the stage and the front door, in the moment after a show when the crowd's roar collapses into a hallway and all you can hear is your own breathing, and you remember that the people you most wanted to sing for are no longer there to answer. Eddie's life began far from spotlights. Born June 16, 1942 in Bessemer, Alabama, then raised in Canton, Ohio, a path shaped by working-class survival and church faith, where singing was not performance, but proof you were still alive. That origin matters because it explains why he never treated music like decoration. He treated it like shelter. Every time he opened his mouth, he was building a room big enough to keep the cold out, big enough to hold a family, big enough to make hunger feel temporary. And it worked until success started demanding its own price. Touring gave him the world, but it also trained him to live in motion, to measure time in flights and sound checks, to be present everywhere except the one place that needed him most. The tragedy is not that he chased fame, it is that fame chased him back into a life where distance becomes normal, where missing a birthday becomes routine, where you tell yourself you will make it up later, and then later never arrives. Still, the story could have remained a familiar legend, the kind we like because it ends with triumph, until November 2006, when his son Gerald Levert died at 40, a loss that did not just take a child, but took an echo, a continuation of Eddie's own voice. A son whose music had braided the family name into a second generation of soul. 2 years later, March 2008, his younger son Sean Levert died at 39 after becoming ill while incarcerated, with the coroner later ruling complications from sarcoidosis as the cause. A situation that carried its own chilling aftertaste because it happened behind institutional walls where time moves slowly unless you are the one running out of it. Imagine what that does to a man who built his entire identity on harmony, on keeping people together, on making pain sound survivable. Imagine the moment the phone rings and you already know what the voice on the other end will do to you, because your body remembers the first collapse and cannot believe it is being asked to do it again. Many people would disappear after that, and no one would blame them. But Eddie returned to the stage, because for him singing is not optional. It is how he keeps a thread tied to the ones he lost, how he refuses to let silence win the argument. Years passed, the world moved on, and grief stayed, settling into the furniture, into old photographs, into the reflex of reaching for someone who is not there. In January 2020, Martha Bird Levert, his former wife and the mother of Gerald and Sean, died, closing another chapter, removing a witness who held the boys not as headlines, but as children, as laughter, as ordinary mornings. And then, in December 2024, Ryan Levert, his youngest daughter, died at 22 after battling lupus, a sentence that lands like a final blow because Ryan represented what so many people secretly hope for after devastation. The idea that life will give you a gentler ending. That love will return in a form that lets you breathe again. For Eddie, that hope became another funeral, another name added to the private list he carries to every microphone. This is where the heartbreak becomes almost unbearable to contemplate. Not that he has suffered, but that he has suffered in a pattern, in waves that arrive before the last one recedes, forcing him to become an expert in continuing. And so the question that hangs over his story now is not whether he is a legend. That part is settled. The question is what it means to keep singing about love when love has cost you this much, whether the stage is his sanctuary or his sentence. Whether the applause comforts him or simply reminds him of how loud the world is compared to a house that will never sound the same again. Before the funerals, before the hospital corridors and folded programs, there was a boy standing in a small Baptist church trying to sing louder than his circumstances. To understand why Eddie Levert's later losses feel almost mythic in their weight, you have to return to that beginning. He was born in Bessemer, Alabama in 1942, a steel town where survival was a daily calculation, and later moved with his family to Canton, Ohio, in search of steadier work and a future that didn't feel predecided. His father labored long hours. His mother stretched faith across thin margins, and the house they built together was less about comfort than endurance. In that house, music wasn't ambition. It was insulation. It was the only thing that made the cold feel temporary. By his teens, Eddie's voice was no longer just promising, it was commanding. Alongside friends in Canton, he formed a vocal group that would eventually evolve into the OJs. The name would change. The lineup would shift. Rejection letters would pile up. But the hunger behind the harmonies stayed the same. They rehearsed in basements and garages, sang at school dances and small clubs, and drove to gigs in cars that rattled louder than their amplifiers. There were nights when they earned barely enough to cover gas. Nights when the only thing keeping them warm was the idea that someone, somewhere, would eventually listen. When they finally signed with Philadelphia International Records in the early 1970s, it felt like the dam had broken. Backstabbers hit first, sharp and urgent, speaking to betrayal in a way that felt both personal and political. Then came Love Train, a song so hopeful it bordered on defiance, inviting the world to board something better than what it had known. For the Love of Money followed, pulsing with warning and groove, proving they could preach without losing rhythm. Within a few short years, millions of records sold. The OJs weren't just successful. They were essential. They were part of the soundtrack of a generation learning how to navigate change, distrust, and possibility all at once. For Eddie, this wasn't fame in the abstract. It was proof that the church boy from Alabama and Ohio had outrun the limits assigned to him. He could now command stages that once seemed unreachable. He could send money home. He could build a life that looked nothing like the one he had escaped. Yet success arrived with its own quiet erosion. Touring schedules grew relentless. 200 shows a year blurred cities into each other, until geography stopped matching. Buses replaced bedrooms. Hotel rooms replaced kitchens. Days lost their names. If he stopped singing, he would later admit it felt like he would stop breathing. The industry, meanwhile, was not always kind. Contracts that looked generous at first glance often hid terms that siphoned away profits. Royalties became arguments. Lawyers became necessary companions. There were years when gold records hung on the wall, while unpaid earnings hovered in dispute. Eddie and his bandmates had to learn that surviving the charts did not automatically mean owning the fruit of their labor. The same voice that brought joy to millions had to fight for its own value behind closed doors. Through all of it, he carried the image of his parents and the early years in Canton like a compass. He did not see himself as a star first. He saw himself as a provider, a man who had promised that his children would never know the kind of hunger he once did. That promise became both motivation and pressure. Gerald and Sean grew up in a world shaped by studios and sound checks, by backstage laughter and long absences. They absorbed music almost by osmosis. Gerald in particular would emerge as a formidable artist in his own right, forming the group Levert and later building a successful solo career. To the public, it looked like legacy unfolding exactly as it should. Father and son, 2 generations, one surname woven into soul history. But the road that built the legend also thinned the hours at home. Fame has a way of stretching a man across distances until he begins to feel divided. Phone calls grow shorter. Visits grow rushed. You tell yourself that your work is for them, that every encore is an investment in their future. Yet children measure love in presence, not ticket sales. Eddie would later reflect on that tension with painful honesty. He had given his family opportunity. He had also, unintentionally, given them absence. By the time the OJs were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2005, Eddie stood beneath lights that symbolized a lifetime of triumph. The applause was thunderous, the legacy undeniable. But even in that moment, he was a man shaped by contrast. He had moved from sleeping in cars to owning homes in multiple states. He had turned church hymns into international anthems. He had accumulated success that industry analysts would eventually estimate in the tens of millions. And yet, he understood something that younger artists often learn too late. Success does not eliminate vulnerability. It only changes the setting in which it appears. When William Powell, one of the group's key members, passed away years earlier, it reminded Eddie that even professional brotherhood is fragile. The OJs would continue, but every lineup change left a quiet gap. "We don't replace people," he has said in interviews. "We carry them." That philosophy would later take on far deeper meaning. But even then, it hinted at a worldview shaped by impermanence. What makes Eddie Levert's story more than a standard music biography is this layering of ascent and cost. Every milestone contains its shadow. Every chart-topping record is balanced by something that required sacrifice. He learned early that greatness is rarely gifted. It is wrestled from circumstance. But he also learned, slowly, that no level of recognition can insulate a man from the unpredictable turns of private life. As the 1990s and early 2000s unfolded, he entered what many artists would consider a comfortable phase: established reputation, stable finances, a catalog that guaranteed packed venues. On paper, it was the reward phase of a long career. In reality, it was the calm before the most devastating storm of his life. The skills that had carried him through poverty and professional battles would soon be tested in a realm no rehearsal could prepare him for. Because while he had mastered the art of singing through pain, he had not yet faced the kind of loss that threatens to silence even the strongest voice. The first call came on a quiet morning in November 2006, the kind of morning that feels ordinary enough to be trusted. At that point in his life, Eddie Levert had survived the grind of the industry, the long tours, the contract battles, the constant pressure to remain relevant in a world that moves on without warning. He had seen friends buried, bandmates replaced, trends fade. He believed he understood loss. He did not. Gerald Levert was not just his eldest son. He was his reflection. Born in July 1966, Gerald had grown up backstage, falling asleep to the hum of amplifiers and the low thunder of his father's voice shaking theater walls. Music was not something he chose. It was something that lived in him before he could explain it. By the 1980s, Gerald had stepped into his own spotlight as part of the R&B group Levert and later as a solo artist. His voice carried velvet and grit in equal measure. He did not imitate his father. He extended him. For Eddie, watching Gerald succeed was different from watching any chart climb. It was validation that the sacrifice had meant something. Every night he had spent away from home, every argument, every moment of doubt seemed justified when he saw his son command a stage. Their duet, "Baby, Hold On to Me," was not simply a record. It was a public affirmation of private pride. You could hear the lineage in it. You could hear a father and son not competing, but harmonizing across time. Then came the news. Gerald was found unresponsive in his home in Cleveland and later pronounced dead at 40. Reports cited a mix of prescription medications as contributing factors. The details blurred for Eddie. What remained was the shock, the unnatural inversion of the world. Parents are not meant to outlive their children. It violates something ancient and unspoken. At the funeral, there were flowers and cameras, condolences and headlines. None of it mattered. Eddie stood over the casket of his firstborn, the same hands that once held Gerald as a newborn, now resting helplessly on polished wood. The man whose voice had powered arenas found himself unable to sing. Grief is not loud at first. It is disorienting. It removes oxygen from the room. Afterward, the house changed. Even if Gerald did not live there, his presence had always been available, through phone calls, through laughter, through collaboration. Suddenly, every ring of the phone carried dread. Every song on the radio became an ambush. People told Eddie to be proud of his son's legacy. Pride is a thin blanket against the cold reality of absence. 2 years later, before that first wound had properly scarred, the second blow landed. In March 2008, Sean Levert, his younger son, died at 39 after falling ill while incarcerated. Official reports listed complications from sarcoidosis. There were questions. There were investigations. There were headlines that briefly flared and then faded. But inside Eddie's world, nothing faded. If Gerald's death had shattered him, Sean's death broke something deeper. It wasn't just repetition, it was escalation. One loss is devastation. Two begins to feel like punishment. The same father who had already stood at one grave was now asked to stand at another. The same church, the same hymns, the same unbearable walk down the aisle. He later described the second call as worse than the first, because this time his body knew what was coming. There is a specific horror in recognition. The moment the voice on the other end pauses, and you already feel your knees weaken. You already feel the room tilt. He would say that it felt like the air had been sucked from his lungs, like time itself had refused to move forward. Martha Bird, his former wife and the mother of Gerald and Sean, grieved alongside him. Divorce does not dissolve shared history. It does not erase the years spent raising children, the arguments over homework, the small domestic victories. In grief, they were not ex-spouses. They were parents, bound again by something neither could escape. The public saw Eddie return to the stage eventually. They saw resilience. They saw professionalism. They saw a legend honoring his sons with music. What they did not see were the nights alone, replaying old voicemails, revisiting photographs, questioning every decision that had ever taken him away from home. Grief invites revision. It tempts you to believe that if one tour had been canceled, if one phone call had lasted longer, if one choice had shifted, everything might be different. He once admitted that performing after the deaths felt almost impossible. The first time he attempted to sing Baby, Hold On To Me alone, his voice cracked. The audience finished the line for him. Thousands of strangers carrying a lyric that once belonged to father and son. In that moment, he understood something cruel and beautiful at once. Music survives even when the people who made it do not. But survival is not the same as healing. Eddie had built his identity around strength, around endurance, around being the man who rose from poverty to prominence. Yet grief does not negotiate with identity. It strips titles. It does not care that you are in a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It does not care that you have gold records. It reduces you to something simpler, a father who wants his sons back. People sometimes frame tragedy as a test of faith. Eddie's faith did not vanish, but it changed. It became quieter, less declarative, more personal. He stopped trying to explain loss and instead learned to coexist with it. There's a difference between asking why and accepting that you may never know. The industry continued. Tours resumed. Applause returned. But underneath every performance was an unspoken layer. When he sang about love, he was singing with memory. When he sang about betrayal, he understood fragility. When he sang about money, he knew its limits. By the late 2000s, observers might have assumed that the worst had already happened. 2 sons gone. A family permanently altered. The narrative arc could have ended there, tragic but contained. It did not, because loss in Eddie Levert's life did not arrive as a single storm. It arrived in waves. And just as he began to find a new rhythm, to breathe again in a world reshaped by absence, fate would return once more, this time targeting the last piece of hope that had helped him stand. After losing Gerald in 2006 and Sean in 2008, Eddie Levert entered a phase of life that few people can truly comprehend. The world saw him continue performing. The OJs still toured. The hits still played. The applause still came. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. Grief had changed from an event into a permanent companion. It no longer arrived in waves. It settled into the walls. He would later admit that the hardest part was not the funerals. It was the mornings, the quiet ones, the first seconds after waking, when for a brief, merciful moment, memory had not yet reassembled itself. In those seconds, his sons were still alive. Then reality would return, steady and unrelenting. That daily re-realization can be more exhausting than the initial shock. It was during this period that he began to understand the difference between public strength and private survival. On stage, he could channel emotion into melody. He could lean on Walter Williams beside him. He could feel the band lift him. But at home, grief has no backing vocals. It is solo work. Yet life, even after devastation, does not completely close its doors. In 2005, just before Gerald's death, Eddie had married Raquel Capleton. Their relationship did not erase the past. It coexisted with it. Raquel entered his life not as a savior, but as a steady presence. She did not attempt to compete with memory. She understood that loving Eddie meant loving a man permanently shaped by loss. Their daughter, Ryan Levert, born in 2002, became a quiet source of renewal. She was younger, separated in age from her brothers, growing up in a world already marked by both fame and fragility. For Eddie, Ryan represented something different. Not replacement, not repair, but continuation. After the deaths of Gerald and Sean, Ryan's presence took on deeper significance. She was laughter in a house that had grown heavy. She was movement where there had been stillness. Eddie has described fatherhood the second time around as gentler, more intentional. Age had slowed him. Experience had softened him. Where once he might have been distracted by touring schedules and studio deadlines, now he lingered longer at the dinner table. He listened more closely. There is something about becoming a father later in life that sharpens awareness. Time feels finite. Moments feel precious. For Eddie, that awareness was amplified by the knowledge of what he had already lost. Ryan was not shielded from the family's history, but she carried it lightly. She had her own interests, her own energy. She teased her father about trending online. She encouraged him in the studio. She reminded him that legacy could feel joyful, not just heavy. But beneath the surface, something was quietly changing. In her late teens and early 20s, Ryan began experiencing health issues. Fatigue that lingered. Pain that seemed disproportionate. Doctors conducted tests. Eventually, the diagnosis came: lupus, an autoimmune disease that turns the body against itself. Chronic illness is different from sudden tragedy. It unfolds slowly. It introduces uncertainty as a daily variable. Good days and bad days alternate without clear pattern. Hospital visits become routine. Medication schedules replace spontaneity. For Eddie, the hospital rooms reopened a familiar dread. The antiseptic smell, the beeping monitors, the quiet conversations with doctors who choose their words carefully. He had sat in similar rooms before. He had prayed similar prayers. But this time he was older, more aware of how fragile hope can be. Ryan approached her illness with resilience. She shared parts of her journey publicly, offering encouragement to others battling lupus. She called herself a fighter. She refused to let diagnosis define her identity. That strength inspired Eddie. Yet inspiration does not eliminate fear. There is a specific kind of helplessness that parents experience when watching their adult children face illness. You cannot step in front of it. You cannot trade places. You can only sit beside them and wait. As 2024 progressed, Ryan's condition worsened. Complications increased. What had once seemed manageable grew more serious. In December 2024, at 22 years old, Ryan Levert passed away following complications related to lupus. The news reverberated beyond the family. Fans who had followed Eddie's journey for decades reacted with disbelief. How much can one man endure? 3 children gone. For Eddie, the third loss was not just repetition. It was culmination. Gerald had been legacy. Sean had been gentleness. Ryan had been renewal. Each child represented a different chapter of his life. With Ryan's passing, the last living thread of that immediate generation was severed. The funeral was intimate. Purple ribbons, symbolizing lupus awareness, rested among the flowers. Eddie stood again where he had stood before, at another casket. At 83, he had outlived his children. It is a sentence that feels unnatural even to write. Afterward, he withdrew from the stage for a time. Silence returned. But this silence felt different from the earlier ones. It was not just shock. It was cumulative weight. Grief layered upon grief until it becomes part of your posture, part of how you move through rooms. Eventually, he returned to performing. Not because the pain had diminished, but because music remained the only language that could contain it. Before stepping into the spotlight, he began whispering 3 names: Gerald, Sean, Ryan. The audience hears a legend singing classics. They see endurance. What they do not see is the ritual, the quiet dedication before the first note, the internal negotiation between heartbreak and duty. Eddie Levert's tragedy is not defined solely by loss. It is defined by continuation, by the decision, night after night, to stand under lights that once felt triumphant and now feel sacred, by the refusal to allow grief to silence what has always been his truest instrument. The story does not end in easy resolution. It ends in motion. An 83-year-old man stepping toward a microphone, carrying decades of harmony and years of heartbreak in the same breath, choosing to sing anyway. When Martha Bird Levert died in January 2020, the headlines were quieter than they had been for her sons. There are no sweeping retrospectives on the state of soul music, no major industry tributes. Yet for Eddie, her passing marked the closing of a chapter that had begun long before the OJs ever signed a contract. Martha was not just his former wife. She was the woman who had stood beside him when the dream still felt fragile. She had seen him rehearse in small Canton clubs wearing second-hand suits. She had held their newborn sons in drafty apartments while he chased gigs across state lines. She had absorbed the long nights and the empty chairs at dinner tables. Their marriage eventually ended, but shared history does not dissolve with legal paperwork. When Gerald died in 2006 and Sean in 2008, Martha carried the same unbearable weight. Divorce had separated them in structure, but grief rejoined them in essence. They were still parents. They still remembered first steps, first notes, childhood laughter that no one else in the world could fully recall. By the late 2000s, Martha lived quietly in Cleveland, surrounded by photographs and gold records that had long since become less about prestige and more about memory. Neighbors describe her as strong, but strength in this context was not loud. It was persistence. It was the act of waking up and continuing to exist inside a house that had once echoed with 3 young voices. When she passed peacefully in her sleep in 2020, it did not generate spectacle. But for Eddie, it was another irreplaceable witness gone. With Martha's death, one of the last people who remembered their sons not as public figures, but as children vanished from daily life. The shared language of parenthood narrowed. He attended her funeral not as an ex-husband, but as a partner in survival. They had walked through fire together. Poverty, fame, loss. He placed a single rose on her casket and later reflected that some bonds are not undone by time or separation. They simply evolve. After Martha's passing, Eddie's world became even more introspective. He and Raquel leaned into quiet routines. Morning coffee, evening conversations, simple rituals that felt grounding in contrast to the chaos of previous years. The Las Vegas home, once a symbol of achievement, became something else entirely, a sanctuary. It is easy to romanticize success in numerical terms. Eddie's net worth is commonly estimated in the high teens to around $20 million. Decades of touring, songwriting, and royalties built that figure. But numbers feel abstract when weighed against funerals. Wealth cannot restore laughter. It cannot replay a voicemail. It cannot change a diagnosis. What it can do, however, is fund legacy. And Eddie began channeling his resources toward purpose. After Sean's death, he became vocal about the need for better health awareness and accountability within incarceration systems. After Ryan's passing, he committed to supporting lupus research and awareness initiatives. Grief, for him, did not transform into bitterness. It transformed into advocacy. He has donated to organizations including the Lupus Foundation of America and the American Heart Association. He has supported scholarships for underprivileged youth through foundations bearing the Levert name. These gestures are not grand announcements. They are quiet continuations. If he cannot change his own story, he can influence someone else's trajectory. Yet philanthropy does not eliminate loneliness. There are evenings when the house feels too large, when photographs on the wall carry more conversation than the room itself. He has admitted in interviews that sometimes he hears laughter in memory so vividly it feels present, not as a haunting, as a reminder. Returning to the stage after Ryan's death was particularly difficult. At 83, retirement would have been understandable. No one would question it. He had earned rest. But for Eddie, music has never been a career alone. It is identity. It is ritual. It is the bridge between what was and what remains. When he stands beside Walter Williams now, the two original pillars of the OJs, the performance carries a different texture. It is not nostalgia. It is testimony. They are not simply revisiting hits. They are carrying absent voices with them. William Powell is gone. So are the sons who once watched from backstage. The harmony that fills arenas is layered with remembrance. Before each show, Eddie pauses. It is not theatrical. It is private. He whispers the names Gerald, Sean, Ryan, sometimes Martha. It is a roll call of love and loss. Only then does he step into the light. The audience sees a legend. They see endurance. They hear familiar melodies that once defined decades. But underneath the polish is something rawer. Every lyric about love now carries additional gravity. Every note about betrayal feels personal. Every groove about money sounds almost ironic. In quieter interviews, he has reflected that success can feel like a larger cage if you do not understand its limits. Fame did not shield him from sorrow. It did not insulate his family from illness or circumstance. What it did provide was a platform. A microphone that remains steady even when the hands holding it tremble. There is a common narrative in celebrity culture that equates longevity with triumph. Eddie Levert's life complicates that narrative. Longevity, in his case, also means witnessing more goodbyes. It means outliving children. It means learning how to wake up inside a story that has rewritten itself too many times. And yet he continues, not because he is untouched, but because he is profoundly touched. The music that once carried him out of poverty now carries him through grief. The boy who sang in church to survive hunger now sings to survive memory. At 83, he stands not as a man unbroken, but as a man unextinguished. There is a difference. Broken things can still function. They can still create beauty. They can still offer comfort to others walking through their own darkness. The tragedy of Eddie Levert is not only that he lost so much, it is that he lost so much and still chooses to give. Night after night, song after song, breath after breath, there is a certain loneliness that only longevity creates. It is not dramatic. It does not always announce itself with tears. It is quieter than that. It sits in the spaces between conversations, in the pauses after applause fades, in the moments when an 83-year-old man walks through a house filled with photographs and realizes he has outlived almost everyone who once filled those frames. For Eddie Levert, survival has never been theoretical. It began as economic survival in Alabama and Ohio. It became professional survival in an industry that discards artists without hesitation. And eventually, it turned into emotional survival, the kind that requires waking up each day and choosing to keep breathing inside a life that has asked more of you than seems fair. People often ask how he does it, how he keeps performing, how he stands under stage lights after burying 3 children. The question assumes strength as something dramatic. In reality, his endurance looks ordinary. It looks like morning routines. It looks like prayer before coffee. It looks like sitting at a piano and touching keys without needing to impress anyone. Age has changed him physically, of course. The voice is still powerful, but it carries texture now, a lived-in grain that cannot be faked. The stage energy is measured rather than explosive. But what has deepened most is intention. When Eddie sings now, he does not chase perfection. He chases presence. Every note feels deliberate, almost sacred. He has spoken about how music gave him structure when everything else felt unstable. In grief, days can blur. Purpose can evaporate. But a rehearsal schedule, a performance date, a sound check, these things anchor time. They prevent sorrow from swallowing entire months. There are still moments when he hesitates before stepping onto the stage. Not from fear of forgetting lyrics, but from memory. Certain songs carry weight. Baby, Hold On To Me is no longer just a duet in history. It is a conversation across absence. Love Train is no longer just optimism. It is defiance. When the crowd sings along, it creates a paradox. Thousands of strangers lifting a melody that was born from deeply personal places. In those moments, Eddie is reminded that pain shared becomes something else. It does not disappear, but it transforms. Offstage, life has narrowed in ways that feel intentional rather than tragic. He and Raquel maintain a steady rhythm. No spectacle, no chaos. Simple meals, quiet evenings, occasional laughter that feels earned rather than automatic. Their home in Las Vegas is less about status and more about stillness. The walls hold photographs of Gerald, Sean, Ryan, Martha, William Powell, decades of OJ's memories. Not arranged as trophies, but as witnesses. He has said before that he does not remove pictures because grief does not require erasure. It requires acknowledgement. He sometimes speaks of sensing his children's presence, not in mystical terms, but in memory. A sudden recall of Gerald's laugh, a phrase Sean used to repeat. Ryan's teasing tone when she called him Daddy, even as an adult. These recollections are not wounds. They are connections. One of the most profound shifts in his later years has been perspective. Fame once felt like a rival. Now it feels like background. What matters most is not the number of albums sold or the number of arenas filled. It is whether he used his time well, whether he loved well, whether he honored the people who shaped him. He has reflected that pain is evidence of love. If the grief is deep, the bond was deeper. That framing does not remove sadness, but it reframes it. It turns tragedy into testimony rather than curse. There are still difficult nights, still anniversaries that reopen memory, still quiet mornings when the house feels heavier than usual. But he no longer asks why in the same way. Age has brought a kind of surrender, not to despair, but to reality. He has lived long enough to see entire musical eras rise and fall, long enough to see vinyl become digital, radio become streaming, legends become footnotes. Yet he remains, not because he resisted change, but because he adapted without losing core identity. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson inside his story. Endurance is not about avoiding pain. It is about integrating it, carrying it without letting it define every corner of your existence. At 83, Eddie Levert is not chasing legacy. Legacy has already settled around him. What he protects now is meaning, the integrity of the songs, the sincerity of the performance, the quiet ritual before each show when he whispers 3 names into the air and steps forward anyway. He is no longer simply the voice behind classic hits. He is the embodiment of something rarer, a man who has absorbed unimaginable loss and still offers his voice as comfort to others. Not because he is untouched, but because he understands exactly what it costs. At 83, Eddie Levert no longer measures life in chart positions or ticket sales. He measures it in moments that do not trend. A quiet sunrise over the Nevada desert. A phone call with an old friend who still remembers the early Canton days. The soft click of a piano key in an empty room. These are the details that remain when the headlines fade. The public narrative calls him a legend, a king of soul, a pillar of the OJs. All of that is true. But the more accurate description might be this. He is a man who has outlived almost everything that once defined him and is still willing to stand in the light. That willingness is not simple. It is not automatic. It is a daily decision. There is a misconception about endurance. People assume it means you no longer feel the weight. In reality, it means you feel it and move anyway. When Eddie walks onto a stage now, he carries more than a microphone. He carries decades of harmony, years of absence, and the memory of 3 children whose names he whispers before every show. Gerald, Sean, Ryan. Those names do not fade with time. They settle deeper. They become part of breath itself. When he sings, he is not performing past pain. He is singing through it. That distinction matters. It is the difference between denial and transformation. The OJ's catalog has always been rooted in emotion. Love Train spoke of unity in a fractured world. Backstabbers confronted betrayal. For the Love of Money warned of temptation. Today, those songs feel layered. They are not relics. They are reminders. Eddie has lived long enough to see how relevant they remain. Human nature has not changed much. Neither has grief. He no longer chases validation. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 2005 confirmed what fans already knew. The gold records, the sold-out tours, the decades of influence, those chapters are secure. What he protects now is authenticity. He has said more than once that he wants to sing it right one more time. Not louder, not flashier, right? There is something almost sacred about an elder artist who continues not for fame, but for faith. Faith in music, faith in memory, faith that offering your voice can still matter. In interviews, he speaks gently about survival. He does not dramatize it. He does not frame himself as heroic. Instead, he emphasizes gratitude for time. I've been given more time than I thought I would, he has said. Time, in his world, is currency more valuable than money ever was. He divides his days between Las Vegas and Canton, Ohio, the city that shaped him. Returning there feels grounding. It reconnects him to the version of himself who sang in church without imagining stadiums. It reminds him that before fame, there was faith. And perhaps that is the final thread running through his story. Faith was present in Alabama. Faith carried him to Ohio. Faith sustained him through industry battles. Faith steadied him at 3 graves. Faith now guides him through quiet evenings and early mornings. Not necessarily religious doctrine alone, but faith in continuity, in the idea that love does not vanish when bodies do. He has funded lupus research in Ryan's name, supported scholarships through the Levert Foundation, donated quietly to causes that align with his experiences. These actions are not attempts to erase loss. They are acknowledgments that grief can generate purpose. When audiences rise to their feet as he sings, they're responding to more than nostalgia. They're responding to testimony, to the sound of someone who has felt life at its extremes and still chooses connection over retreat. There will come a day when he no longer steps onto a stage. Age makes that inevitable. But even then, the music will continue. Love Train will still roll through speakers. Gerald's voice will still echo through recordings. Sean's harmonies will still exist in archive tracks. Ryan's encouragement will still live in memory. The tragedy of Eddie Levert is undeniable. 3 children gone, a former wife buried, brothers and bandmates lost to time. But the deeper story is not solely about what he lost. It is about what he refused to surrender. He refused to surrender his voice. He refused to surrender his belief in music. He refused to surrender love, even when love hurt beyond language. At 83, he stands not as a man untouched by heartbreak, but as a man defined by how he carried it. When the lights rise and the first chord sounds, he closes his eyes and offers the same quiet prayer he has carried for decades. Let me sing it right, just one more time. And in that prayer, there is no bitterness, only reverence.